There are stories that live in the soil, in the blood. They are not memories, but active, breathing things. In the red clay of Macon County, Alabama, one such story began to stir in 1932. It was an experiment, a study, born under the banner of public health and scientific inquiry. It promised medicine. It delivered a lie. For 40 years, this study would breathe, grow, and feed not on data points or cellular samples, but on the slow, deliberate decay of human beings. It would watch and record as men withered from a disease for which a cure was readily available. This was not a monster with fangs and claws, but a horror that wore a lab coat, carried a clipboard, and spoke in the calm, reasonable tones of medical authority. How does a nation sworn to protect its citizens become the architect of their suffering? At what precise moment does the oath to do no harm curdle into a mandate to observe, to document, and to allow death to run its clinical course? This is the central, chilling question of the Tuskegee study of untreated syphilis in the Negro male. It is a story of a scientific inquiry that lost its soul, becoming a 4-decade vigil over preventable tragedy. It forces us to ask what happens when the perceived value of data outweighs the sacred value of a human life, and how an entire system of doctors, nurses, and government officials could participate in a conspiracy of silence. The final arithmetic is as stark as a tombstone. 600 African American men, mostly poor sharecroppers, were enrolled. Nearly 400 of them had the disease. The others served as a control group, a baseline for normalcy against which to measure the progression of ruin. For 40 years, the men with syphilis were denied treatment. They were denied penicillin, the miracle drug available to the world since the mid-1940s. They were denied the truth. The study's purpose was not to heal, but to track the disease from infection to autopsy, to harvest the final, irrefutable data from the stillness of the morgue. This is the story of that harvest. The nightmare did not begin as a nightmare. It began with noble intentions, a common and insidious genesis for great evil. In the late 1920s, the Julius Rosenwald Fund, a philanthropic organization dedicated to the well-being of African Americans, financed a project to combat the staggering rates of syphilis in the rural South. The initial plan was simple and humane: find the disease and treat it. Macon County, Alabama was selected as the epicenter for this effort. It was a place of deep poverty and deeper segregation, a closed system where a large, medically underserved black population lived and worked, largely at the mercy of the white landowners. The prevalence of syphilis there was alarmingly high, estimated at 35%. It was a public health crisis demanding intervention. The location was chosen with a cold, strategic calculus. Macon County offered a stable, stationary population of subjects, men unlikely to travel far or have access to alternative medical care. They were sharecroppers tied to the land by debt and tradition. Furthermore, the presence of the esteemed Tuskegee Institute and its John A. Andrew Memorial Hospital provided a crucial element, a veneer of trust and legitimacy. The participation of this respected black institution, staffed by black doctors and nurses, would be essential in persuading the local men to cooperate with a study run by the white-dominated United States Public Health Service. The stage was set not yet for a horror, but for a public health initiative. The first sign of the rot came with the Great Depression. As the nation's economy collapsed, the Rosenwald Fund withdrew its financing for the treatment phase of the project. The Public Health Service, now in sole control, faced a choice. They could abandon the work or they could repurpose it. It was here, in the cold corridors of bureaucracy, that a new idea took root. The officials saw a unique opportunity, a never-to-be-repeated chance to study the long-term effects of untreated syphilis. The existing pool of infected men in Macon County was no longer a group of patients to be cured, but a perfect, ready-made laboratory. The mission shifted from treatment to observation. The lie was conceived. The men would be told they were being treated for bad blood, a vague colloquial term for a host of ailments. In reality, they were being enrolled in a study of their own demise. This monstrous transformation was made possible by the enabling conditions of the era. The bedrock of the study was the pervasive scientific racism that permeated American medicine. It was a commonly held belief among many white physicians that syphilis manifested differently in black bodies than in white ones, supposedly affecting the cardiovascular system more and the neurological system less. This theory, lacking any real scientific basis, provided a convenient rationalization. The study, its architects argued, would provide valuable data on these supposed racial differences. This dehumanizing ideology, combined with the immense power imbalance between the federal government and poor, uneducated black sharecroppers, created an environment where such an experiment was not only possible, but was seen by some as a legitimate scientific pursuit. The men were not seen as individuals, but as a collection of symptoms to be cataloged. With the lie in place, the study began to develop its routine, its grim and repeatable pattern. The men were recruited with promises that seemed to them a godsend in a life of hardship. They were offered free physical examinations, free rides to and from the clinic, hot meals on examination days, and, most persuasively, a burial stipend to cover funeral expenses. For men who had little, this was a powerful incentive. The study became a fixture in their lives, a recurring event marked by the arrival of the government car and the familiar face of the public health nurse. The periodic examinations were real, but the treatments were a fiction. The men were given tonics, aspirin, and other ineffective placebos. The most painful deception involved spinal taps, an invasive and agonizing procedure to collect cerebrospinal fluid. The men were told this was a special free treatment. It was, in fact, purely for data collection, a diagnostic procedure masquerading as a cure. The machinery of this evil was oiled by a quiet, bureaucratic efficiency. At its center was Nurse Eunice Rivers, an African-American public health nurse who became the study's indispensable link to the community. For 40 years, she was the human face of the experiment. It was she who knew the men by name, who drove them to their appointments, who sat with their families. Her presence built a bridge of trust over a chasm of deceit. Her motivations remain a subject of complex debate. Was she a naive functionary, a victim of the system herself, or a willing accomplice? Regardless, her role was critical. She was the shepherdess who kept the flock from straying, ensuring the subjects remained in the study year after year, death after death. This machinery extended far beyond her. The Public Health Service compiled a list of the subjects and provided it to the Alabama Health Department, local doctors, and even the United States military. The instructions were clear. If any of these men presented for treatment for syphilis, they were to be denied it and referred back to the study. During World War II, when many of the men were drafted, the study intervened to prevent them from receiving the standard mandatory treatment for syphilis given to all other soldiers. The experiment was to be protected at all costs. The psychological landscape of the perpetrators was a masterwork of compartmentalization. The doctors and officials involved were not cackling villains. They were, in their public lives, respected men of science, family, men, pillars of their communities. They built careers on the data gleaned from Macon County. They published at least a dozen major articles in prestigious medical journals, coolly detailing the progression of the disease in their human subjects. They presented their findings at conferences, accepting the accolades of their peers. Within the sterile language of these publications, lesions, cardiovascular events, neurological decline, the human agony was erased. The men were abstracted into data sets, their suffering transformed into charts and graphs. This rationalization was the key. By viewing the men as subjects rather than patients, as a means to a scientific end, the researchers could maintain their professional facade while presiding over a slow-motion atrocity. The most profound moral breach, the moment the study crossed the line from passive negligence into active, undeniable evil, came in the mid-1940s. Penicillin emerged as a miracle cure for syphilis. It was cheap, effective, and widely available. The disease that had plagued humanity for centuries was now easily conquerable. The researchers in the Tuskegee study knew this. They discussed it. They held meetings and wrote memos weighing the value of their uncontaminated data against the lives of the men. The decision was made. They would not only withhold the cure, they would actively prevent the men from receiving it elsewhere. This was the study's heart of darkness. Every day that passed, every man who sickened, every wife who was infected, every child born with congenital syphilis from that point forward was not a result of ignorance or circumstance. It was the result of a conscious, deliberate choice made by men of medicine. The study could have ended, but its institutional momentum and the perceived value of its data were too great. The observation had to continue right up to the autopsy table. Through the 1950s and 1960s, the study reached its zenith of horror, operating as a self-perpetuating institution. It had outlived many of its original architects and subjects, yet it continued, driven by its own internal logic. The annual roundups in Macon County were a normalized part of the landscape. New generations of public health service doctors inherited the project, accepting its premises without question. The study's public persona was that of a landmark longitudinal investigation, a noble quest for knowledge. Its private reality was a death watch. The dual existence was seamless. In Washington, it was a line item in a budget, a file in a cabinet. In Alabama, it was the slow, inexorable destruction of families. The confidence of the researchers was at its peak. They were protected by the full authority of the federal government and the silent complicity of the wider medical establishment. The invisible victims were the men themselves, their families, and their communities. Men like Charlie Pollard, who for decades believed the government was helping him with his bad blood. He dutifully showed up for every examination, trusting the doctors and Nurse Rivers. He spoke of the study with a kind of gratitude, unaware that the men in charge were documenting his body's surrender to a curable disease. The suffering radiated outwards. The official numbers, cold as they are, tell part of the story. By the end of the study, at least 28 men had died directly from advanced syphilis. Another 100 had died from related complications. At least 40 of their wives had been infected, and 19 children had been born with congenital syphilis, starting their lives with a disease that could have been prevented. These are the known victims. The true toll, measured in broken health, shortened lives, and shattered trust, is incalculable. Society looked away because, for the most part, it was never asked to look. The study was an open secret within a closed community. Its findings, as mentioned, were published in mainstream medical journals. The titles were Clinical, Academic. A 20-year observation of untreated syphilitic Negroes, for instance. The methodology sections of these papers implicitly stated that treatment was being withheld. Yet no outcry came from the American Medical Association. No investigations were launched by other public health bodies. This silence was a form of active complicity. The study was protected by two powerful forces: the unimpeachable prestige of the U.S. Public Health Service and the profound societal indifference to the lives of poor, rural black men. They were the perfect victims because, to the systems of power, they were invisible. Their suffering did not register. It was simply data. The first cracks in this wall of silence appeared not from the outside world, but from within the institution itself. The world was changing. The civil rights movement had fundamentally altered the nation's moral landscape. making the overt racism of previous generations increasingly untenable. In the world of medicine, the horrors of Nazi medical experimentation revealed at the Nuremberg trials had led to the establishment of the Nuremberg Code in 1947, which stated that the voluntary, informed consent of human subjects was absolutely essential. The Tuskegee study violated this principle in every conceivable way. A new ethical consciousness was dawning, and the study was a relic from a darker time, living on borrowed time. The internal pressure came from a man named Peter Buxton. In 1965, Buxton was a young venereal disease investigator and epidemiologist for the Public Health Service in San Francisco. He was, in essence, a frontline soldier in the war against syphilis. In conversation with colleagues, he first heard rumors of the Tuskegee study. He was appalled. He began to investigate, pulling the published papers and internal documents. The more he learned, the more horrified he became. In 1966, he wrote a formal letter of protest to the director of the Division of Venereal Diseases, outlining the profound moral and ethical violations of the study. He argued that the world had changed, that the study was indefensible, and that the men must be treated immediately. His protest was met with bureaucratic inertia. The high-level officials at the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, which now oversaw the PHS, convened a panel to review Buxton's concerns. The panel, comprised of the very men who were running the study, concluded that the project should continue until all the subjects had died and been autopsied. Their rationale was that the study was too far along to abandon. The data had to be collected. They dismissed Buxton's ethical objections. Undeterred, Buxton wrote another, more forceful letter in 1968. Again, he was rebuffed and told that his concerns were noted, but that the decision was final. He had exhausted all official channels. The system was protecting itself. But Buxton was not finished. He had one last option: to break the code of silence and take the story to the outside world. He decided to become a whistleblower. He contacted a journalist. This was the breakthrough. The slow-moving 40-year-old horror was about to collide with the speed of the 24-hour news cycle. The raid did not come with sirens and flashing lights. It came with the quiet clatter of a teletype machine. In July of 1972, Peter Buxton shared his research with John Heller, an investigative reporter for the Associated Press. He gave her the names, the dates, the published papers, the internal memos. He gave her the truth. On July 25, 1972, Heller's story appeared on the front page of the Washington Star. The next day, it was on the front page of the New York Times. The headline was an explosion. Syphilis victims in U.S. study went untreated for 40 years. The public reaction was one of visceral shock and disbelief. The story was so monstrous, so antithetical to the nation's image of itself, that many found it hard to comprehend. The quiet horror of Macon County was now a deafening national scandal. The federal government, which had nurtured and protected the study for 4 decades, was now caught in a firestorm of its own making. The collapse was immediate. Within hours of the story breaking, Assistant Secretary for Health and Scientific Affairs Dr. Merlin Duval announced the termination of the study. The accounting began. Federal officials were dispatched to Macon County to find the remaining survivors and, for the first time, to offer them real treatment. Imagine the moment of that revelation. Imagine being an elderly man like Charlie Pollard, who for 40 years believed he was receiving the best care from his government, only to be told that he had been a laboratory animal in a secret experiment. The trust that Nurse Rivers had so carefully cultivated was revealed to be the instrument of a profound betrayal. Investigators began the grim task of cataloging the damage, reviewing the records, counting the dead, and tracing the web of infection that had spread through families. The full documented scope of the horror was finally being pieced together, not for a scientific paper, but for the historical record of a national disgrace. The reckoning came swiftly, at least on the surface. Senator Edward Kennedy convened congressional hearings in 1973, bringing the officials who ran the study into the harsh glare of public scrutiny. Their testimony was a chilling study in bureaucratic self-justification. They spoke of scientific protocols and the value of the data, their words utterly disconnected from the human cost. An ad hoc advisory panel was formed, and its final report was unequivocal, stating the study was ethically unjustified from the beginning, and that penicillin should have been provided to the men. A class action lawsuit was filed by the NAACP on behalf of the victims and their families. In 1974, it was settled out of court for $10 million. But this was a civil settlement, despite the clear evidence of malfeasance and the deaths of dozens of American citizens. Not a single person involved in the Tuskegee study was ever criminally prosecuted. The individuals retired with their government pensions intact. The institution was condemned, but the men who were the institution walked away. For the survivors and their families, the aftermath was a complex mix of relief and enduring pain. The settlement provided lifetime medical and health benefits for the survivors, their wives, widows, and offspring. The burial stipends, once a tool of deception, were now an official funded promise. But no amount of money could erase the decades of suffering, the physical ailments that became permanent disabilities, or the deep psychological wound of betrayal. Men like Herman Shaw and Charlie Pollard, once unwitting subjects, became powerful public witnesses, their quiet dignity giving a human face to the tragedy. They formed organizations to ensure their story was not forgotten, to transform their experience from one of passive victimhood into one of active advocacy for ethical medicine. They carried the burden of their past, but they also carried the torch of its lessons. The failures and attempted cover-ups continued even after the exposure. Initial statements from the Public Health Service were defensive, laced with the same racist logic that had birthed the study. Officials argued that the men were uneducated and would not have sought or complied with treatment anyway. A classic case of blaming the victim. They attempted to minimize the harm, to frame the study as a well-intentioned project that simply continued for too long. This refusal to accept full responsibility highlighted the systemic nature of the problem. It wasn't one or two bad apple researchers. It was an entire institutional culture that saw these men as less than human, their bodies as a resource to be exploited for the greater good of science. The greatest failure of the reckoning was the absence of individual accountability. Without prosecutions, the message was clear. One could preside over a lethal, unethical experiment for decades, and the worst consequence would be a forced retirement and public embarrassment. The cultural legacy of the Tuskegee study is profound and enduring. It stands as perhaps the single most infamous example of medical malpractice and unethical research in American history. The scandal led directly to a revolution in the protection of human subjects. The National Research Act of 1974 was a direct result, mandating the formation of institutional review boards, or IRBs, at any institution receiving federal funding for research. These boards are now required to review and approve all studies involving human subjects to ensure they are ethically sound. The study also prompted the creation of the National Commission for the Protection of Human Subjects of Biomedical and Behavioral Research, which produced the 1979 Belmont Report. This document established the three core ethical principles that now govern all human subject research: respect for persons, beneficence, and justice. In a very real sense, the modern framework of medical ethics was built upon the ruins of the Tuskegee study. But there is a darker, more persistent legacy. The study created a deep and justified chasm of distrust between the African American community and the medical establishment. For decades, Tuskegee has been shorthand for a fear of exploitation, a suspicion that black bodies are seen as expendable in the pursuit of medical knowledge. This distrust has had tangible negative consequences, contributing to lower participation rates by African Americans in clinical trials and a greater reluctance to engage with the healthcare system, a legacy that health officials still grapple with today during public health crises. In 1997, President Bill Clinton held a ceremony at the White House, formally apologizing to the handful of surviving members of the study. He spoke the words the government had avoided for so long. What the United States government did was shameful, and I am sorry. The apology was a vital and necessary act of national contrition. But it also begs a final haunting question. What is the half-life of a 40-year lie? And what do we, the living, owe to the dead whose names were recorded not in a book of life, but on a data sheet for a study of death? The lesson of Tuskegee is not just about a historical atrocity. It is a permanent warning to watch the watchers, to question authority, and to never forget that behind every statistic there is a human heart that beats and bleeds.